For the hammer, we put it in a paper bag and tested the blood samples. We also used the oil and powder method to remove the fingerprints and test them against the suspects. Similar to the hammer, we collected the blood samples from the counter. We then collected the fingerprints and tested them against the suspects' ink-collected prints. For the whiteboard and ground, we collected the blood samples and tested them with the suspect's samples. The hair was crucial in breaking the case. We looked at all the hairs and fibers found on Mr. Frank and examined them under a microscope. Once we learned the teacher's length and color, it was simple to find the murderer.
Mr. Frank was said to be murdered between 3 and 5. While going through the testimony, we learned that Miss Fetzko left immediately after school and Miss Burvey left soon after with Miss Kong. They were the last two to see Mr. Frank around 3:20. Mr. Hoffmeyer left around 4 and saw Mr. Hoover, who stayed until 6. Miss McDonald was at school with students until 3:30 and they stayed alone until 4:45. Miss Roberts was last seen at 4:10 and reported she left the room at 4:30. Mr. Hoover reported to have seen Miss Roberts looking frantic outside around 4:10. She was standing by her car, which was pulled around the back of the school. Miss Hall reported that Zach Morris was switched out of Mr. Frank's class and moved into Miss Roberts' class. His switch was due to bad behavior. He is now Mrs. Roberts' responsibility.
Our suspects for this crime include Miss Fetzko, Mr. Hoover, Mrs. Burvey, Mrs. McDonald, Miss Roberts, and Zach Morris. After viewing the fingerprints found in B104, we narrowed it down to Miss Fetzko, Miss Burvey, Miss Roberts, and Zach Morris. Once looking at blood samples, we narrowed it down to all suspects with A blood type. And following that, we looked at fibers and hair samples. We found that Miss Roberts' hair was found on Mr. Frank, and her fingerprints were found on both the counter and the hammer. Her blood type was also splattered around the crime. Miss Roberts entered the lab to talk to Mr. Frank about the students switching in. The argument got heated, and Miss Roberts threw a punch at Mr. Frank, splattering blood on the counter and hammer. Mr. Frank threw one back and pushed Miss Roberts into the board, leaving blood on the board and in front of the floor. Miss Roberts pushed Mr. Frank to the floor and grabbed the charging cord from the table. She strangled him until he was lifeless. Our prime suspect is Miss Roberts. Her fingerprints were found on the hammer and the countertop in B104, and her blood type was found in the area as well. Also, her hair was found on Mr. Frank's body. On March 14th, she was wearing a multicolored dress and white sweater. The fiber samples that were found on Mr. Frank matched the fibers. Her motive comes from Zach Morris. The student was particularly difficult and moved from Mr. Frank's class to her class. Out of rage and irritation, she murdered Mr. Frank.